This chapter covers the structure of quasi-experimental designs and also goes into non-experimental designs. Now remember, your book makes the distinction that non-experimental designs are a little different than quasi-experimental designs. However, as mentioned previously, we're not going to go into those very specific distinctions. So we're going to put quasi-experimental designs into that non-experimental category. And then remember, the experiments are all those other things that determine cause and effects. This chapter also discusses developmental research designs, and what I'm going to try to do is at least break up the PowerPoint videos into smaller 15-minute videos so that you don't have to process it all at once. I may or may not be able to add in activities for each of those videos, but just to make it a little bit easier for you to digest, it'll be smaller chunks. So you'll have to watch, 3 or 4 different videos to get through the entire chapter. So hopefully this looks familiar. I just want to remind you of the distinctions that were discussed between our experimental and our non-experimental designs. We're looking to see if something's being manipulated. If yes, was random assignment used? If yes, it's experimental. Now, when we get into quasi-experimental, sometimes it looks like something's being manipulated. So then we have to look and see, well, was random assignment used? Are there controls there? And if not, that's when it also becomes non-experimental in nature. So we've already mentioned this a little bit. We introduced this term quasi-experimental before, and so it's just kind of remember that quasi means kind of, sort of, almost, but not quite experimental in nature. So they really do often look a lot like true experiments. What you're going to see in quasi-experimental strategies are studies that produce scores that can be compared for significant differences. The researcher can't use random assignment, so you see these two groups, and scores are compared between those two groups, but random assignment wasn't used. It just can't be used, and so the groups have been created naturally in some way. So here's an example. So imagine researchers wanted to look at a group of individuals and measure the amount of Facebook use, the effect of Facebook use on anxiety. And so they took these individuals and they asked them, do you use Facebook or do you not use Facebook? And then they grouped them accordingly. People who used Facebook were in one group of individuals, and people who didn't use Facebook were in another group of individuals. And then they looked at those anxiety levels and they compared them. Now this might kind of sound familiar. It's an example from exam 1. I modified a little bit here to make a specific type of example here. Now, is anything being manipulated here? No. They have two groups, but they are naturally occurring. People who already use Facebook and people who don't use Facebook. And then they measure their anxiety levels. So what we have here are what are called non-equivalent groups. And this is something else that we've also already touched on previously, is this idea of non-equivalent groups. And so if we remember, these are groups that may have participant characteristics that are different than one another, because we're not using things like random assignment or matching. We're not controlling for other variables because they're already pre-existing groups. So no random assignment to the groups, there's no assurance of the equivalent groups. So important to remember when we talk about experiments, we have those equivalent groups. When we get to these quasi-experimental and non-experimental strategies, we don't have those equivalent groups. So for another example, imagine a teacher who wants to evaluate a new teaching method of teaching fractions to third graders. One way would be to conduct a study with a treatment group consisting of one class of third grade students and a control class of another group of third grade students. This design is also non-equivalent because the students aren't randomly assigned to the classes, right? It's one pre-existing class here, one pre-existing class there. And you can think about that. Perhaps when we talked about that idea of non-equivalent groups, perhaps there's something different between these, right? Those participant characteristics, because we didn't control for those. Maybe the parents that have more higher achieving or more motivated students are more likely to request Ms. Williams' class. Or the principal might have assigned the troublemakers all to Mr. Jones' class because he's a strong disciplinarian. There's other things that also might create non-equivalent groups: the teacher's styles, classroom environments, motivation among the students, all sorts of different things. And so in the end, If there's a difference between the two groups, one group is taught how to solve fractions using one method and test scores are examined at the end. The other classroom is taught a different method of solving fractions and a test score is administered at the end. If there's a difference, it could be because of the different teaching methods, but it could also be because of differences between the groups. So it's just something to keep in mind with these quasi-experimental strategies. So now we're going to go in and talk about different designs within these quasi